They don't call it a hospital. Not really. Hospitals are places of healing, places where people fight for their lives. Blackwood Asylum isn't like that. It's a prison disguised as a hospital, a place where the patients aren't here to get better. They're here to be contained. The walls aren't just stained with age, they pulse, as if something behind them is trying to push through. The air isn't sterile, it reeks of something decayed, something alive that shouldn't be. The overhead lights flicker, not because of faulty wiring, but because something unseen moves just above them, stretching its limbs through the circuits. The patients don't scream, at least not in the way you'd expect. They whisper from their rooms, their voices slipping under locked doors like smoke, calling out names they shouldn't know, including yours. Some of them don't even have mouths, but they still find ways to speak. And then, there are the ones who aren't supposed to be here at all. The ones who knock on doors late at night, who stand in the middle of the hallways with their heads tilted at an unnatural angle, waiting. They told me this was a job, a simple night shift at a secluded hospital. They lied. I work at a hospital for monsters, and if I break the rules, I won't live to see morning. I took the job because I was desperate. Bills were piling up, and I needed something, anything, to keep myself afloat. The listing was vague. Overnight nurse needed at a private medical facility. High pay, immediate hire. I should have questioned why a hospital was paying so much for a simple night shift. I should have asked why the building wasn't on any maps, why it was buried so deep in the forest that no one outside of staff even knew it existed. But I didn't ask, and that was my first mistake. The drive there was unsettling. My GPS lost signal 10 miles before I reached the hospital gates. I had to rely on an old, faded sign pointing down a narrow, winding road, one that cut through the trees like a scar. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The headlights barely seemed to penetrate the thick mist that clung to the ground. When I finally saw the hospital, a cold weight settled in my stomach. The building was massive, too big for the number of cars parked outside. The windows were dark, and the few that weren't had figures standing behind them, not moving, just watching. I nearly turned back, but then I thought about my overdue rent, the eviction notice taped to my apartment door, the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter. So I swallowed my fear, stepped inside, and signed my name on the employment papers. The moment the pen left the page, the doors locked behind me. Dr. Holloway, the head nurse, was waiting for me at the front desk. She was pale, not sickly pale, too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Her uniform was pristine, but her hands were ice cold when she shook mine. "You're the new night shift nurse?" she asked. I nodded. My throat was dry. The air here was thick, heavy, like breathing in something rotten. "Follow me." She led me down the hallways, past rooms with no numbers, past doors with locks on the outside instead of the inside. I heard things, scratching from behind the walls, a faint humming from somewhere above us, and once a deep, shuddering breath right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. We stopped at a metal door near the nurse's station. It had a huge, rusted bolt keeping it shut. Dr. Holloway gestured for me to stop. "Before you do anything else," she said, her voice low, "you need to learn the rules." She handed me a small, leather-bound notebook. The edges were torn. The pages were covered in dark, smudged fingerprints. I flipped it open. The 5 strange rules. Rule 1. Never look a patient in the eyes for more than 3 seconds. If you do, they will remember you. And if they remember you, they will follow you home. Rule 2. If you hear scratching inside the walls, do not investigate. It isn't rats. It isn't broken pipes. It's something that wants to get out. And if you see it, it will know you exist. Rule 3. The morgue must be locked at exactly 3:33 a.m. If it isn't, the bodies inside will get up. They don't always stay in their own skin. Rule 4. If a patient knocks on your door after midnight, do not answer. They aren't supposed to leave their rooms. If they are, it isn't really them anymore. Rule 5. When the head doctor does his nightly rounds, stand perfectly still. He doesn't walk, he glides. And if he notices you breathing, he will take you with him. My stomach twisted as I read the rules. I looked up at Dr. Holloway, expecting her to laugh, to say it was some kind of sick joke. But she wasn't laughing. She wasn't even blinking. "You think this is funny?" she whispered. "You think we'd still be here if these rules weren't real?" Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. I forced myself to nod. I didn't believe her. Not really. But then, from somewhere down the hall, a door creaked open. A long, dragging sound followed. a wet, slithering noise that made my stomach twist. Dr. Holloway didn't even flinch. "It's starting. Welcome to your first shift," she murmured. "Try not to die." Dr. Holloway's words clung to me like a second skin as she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit hallway. The air felt thicker now, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Somewhere down the corridor, the dragging sound continued. It was slow, deliberate, as if something slick with moisture was pulling itself across the floor. I wanted to turn around to see what was making that sound, but I didn't, because I had a feeling that if I did, I wouldn't like what I saw. I forced my legs to move, each step careful, calculated. The hospital was silent, except for the faint hum of flickering lights and the occasional distant whisper, voices slipping through the cracks of closed doors. My station was just ahead, a small desk tucked into an alcove between patient rooms. I sank into the chair, my hands shaking as I set the notebook on the desk. I skimmed the rules again, my eyes catching on the first one. Never look a patient in the eyes for more than 3 seconds. If you do, they will remember you. And if they remember you, they will follow you home. A chill crept down my spine. I thought about the windows outside, the dark figures standing behind them. Had they been watching me? Counting the seconds? A sharp knock on the desk made me jump. I looked up. A patient stood before me. He was tall, impossibly so, his shoulders hunched to fit beneath the ceiling lights. His hospital gown was too small, stretched over a frame that seemed to shift under his skin, like his bones couldn't decide where they should be. His face was mostly shadowed, but I saw his lips, dry, cracked, moving. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. But my body betrayed me, my gaze flicking up, catching his eyes. 1. His pupils were wrong. They weren't round, weren't human. They were stretched, spiraling inward, pulling at the edges of his irises like a black hole devouring light. 2. His lips moved faster now, whispering something just below my range of hearing. His fingers twitched at his sides, his knuckles sharp enough to cut. 3. I tore my gaze away, my breath hitching. Too late. A low chuckle rattled from his throat. It was dry, brittle, like something ancient and broken had just found something new to play with. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. His voice was layered, as if more than one person was speaking through him. I opened my mouth to respond, but he was already walking away. No, gliding. His feet barely touched the ground as he vanished around the corner, disappearing into the darkness. The air around me felt different now. He had remembered me. He knew who I was. My stomach twisted. The rule hadn't said what happened next. It only said they would follow me home. I swallowed hard and forced myself to breathe. I needed to focus. There were more rules to follow. A sudden, frantic scratching filled the hallway. It was coming from inside the walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edges of the desk. Do not investigate. That was rule 2. It isn't rats. It isn't broken pipes. It's something that wants to get out. The scratching grew more intense, nails clawing at the plaster, the sound vibrating through my bones. I felt the thing behind the wall, felt its weight pressing against the thin barrier that separated us. I bit my tongue and stayed still. The scratching stopped, but the wall breathed. A slow, stretching motion, like something just beneath the surface was shifting. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't dare acknowledge it. After a moment, the wall fell still again. I exhaled shakily and checked my watch. 3:29 a.m. The morgue. I shoved the notebook into my pocket and bolted from my chair, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty corridor. The hospital stretched before me in endless, twisting hallways, each one darker than the last. The air smelled different here, cold and metallic. The morgue door was just ahead, slightly ajar. My heart stopped. It was supposed to be locked. I took a cautious step forward. The cold air pouring from the morgue made my skin prickle. I swallowed my fear and reached for the handle, my fingers closing around the freezing metal. A whisper slithered out of the morgue. Not a voice, not words. Something else. A sound that crawled beneath my skin, that curled itself into my thoughts. I yanked the door shut and fumbled for the keys. My hands were numb, shaking, but I forced the key into the lock. I turned it. Click. The lock engaged. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, my forehead pressed against the cold door. Then, something pressed back. A hand. The pressure was light at first, then firmer, fingers dragging slowly down the surface. I didn't move. The fingers stopped, a single, sharp knock. Then silence. I backed away, my legs weak, my breath shallow. I turned, my body still trembling, and walked, ran, back toward my station. I needed to check the last 2 rules. I reached the desk and grabbed the notebook with shaking hands. Rule 4. If a patient knocks on your door after midnight, do not answer. I stared at the words, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then, somewhere behind me, a knock. My blood turned to ice. Another knock. I gripped the edges of the desk, my knuckles white. Then, a voice. Not one voice, many, whispering my name. I squeezed my eyes shut, biting down hard on my lip. It isn't really them anymore. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The whispering continued. The knocks grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The air felt heavier, wrong, but the presence, it was gone. I forced my eyes open, my vision swimming. My throat was dry, my body shaking. I had followed the rules. I had survived. But there was still one left. The worst one. Rule 5. The head doctor does his nightly rounds. I turned to check my watch, and my heart nearly stopped. 4 a.m. I hadn't even realized what time it was. The hallway ahead of me was empty, but the hallway behind me, a shadow stretched across the floor. Long, twisted. And then, the sound. Not footsteps. A soft, gliding motion. Getting closer. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. Because if he noticed me breathing, he would take me with him. The shadow stretched longer, twisting unnaturally across the floor, as if it didn't belong to the figure making it. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into my bones, settling deep, freezing me from the inside out. The gliding sound continued. Slow, smooth, unnatural. I could feel him now. The head doctor. He wasn't just passing through. He was looking for something. Or someone. The hall around me seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing in from all sides, the darkness curling like fingers, hungry. The head doctor stopped. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him right behind me. He was waiting, listening. I pressed my lips together, tightening every muscle in my body. The air around me shifted. He was leaning closer. The gliding sound started again, circling me. My lungs burned from holding my breath. My vision swam at the edges, but I wouldn't dare to move. And then a whisper, not in my ear, inside my head. You shouldn't be here. The voice was silk, soft and suffocating, wrapping around my thoughts like a tightening noose. You don't belong. A cold breath slithered across the back of my neck. The gliding stopped. Silence. A presence loomed over me, too close, too wrong. I felt him watching, waiting for me to fail. I focused on nothing, on empty darkness, forcing my body to remain still. My chest screamed for air, but I couldn't let it rise. Then something cold touched my skin. Fingertips. They traced lightly over my shoulder, slow, deliberate, testing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I didn't, because if he noticed me breathing, he would take me with him. His fingers stopped, and then he moved away. The gliding sound resumed, vanishing into the hall, further and further, until it was gone. I stood there, frozen, my pulse hammering so violently I thought I might pass out. The air around me warmed again, the shadows slinking back into their places. I gasped in air, my body shaking, my lungs burning as I sucked in sharp, ragged breaths. I was still here. He hadn't taken me. But I knew, deep in my bones, that if I had moved even an inch, if I had made even the tiniest sound, I would not be standing here anymore. I swallowed the terror curling in my throat and checked the clock. 4:06 a.m. Somehow, the shift wasn't over yet, and then I heard it, scratching. Not in the walls this time, at the door. A slow rhythmic dragging of nails against wood, long, deep tearing. A patient. The rule, Rule 4. If a patient knocks on your door after midnight, do not answer. I clenched my fists, my nails biting into my palms. Knock, knock. Slow, purposeful, wrong. I squeezed my eyes shut. Not real, not real. But the knocking grew louder, more insistent. And then a voice, faint enough that I almost thought I imagined it. Let me in. A whisper. Just beyond the door, the voice sounded familiar. It sent an instant chill through me, because I knew that voice. It was mine. I backed away from the desk, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. Please, the voice pleaded, let me in. I shook my head. No, no. The door handle rattled. I pressed my hands to my ears, refusing to listen, refusing to acknowledge it. A shadow moved beneath the door. A shape. Then a low, distorted laugh. Not mine, something else. Something wearing my voice. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't answer. And finally, the knocking stopped. The presence outside faded. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I had followed the rule. But as I looked down, my stomach dropped, because the bottom of the door wasn't empty anymore. There was something beneath it, a single slip of paper. I hesitated, every nerve screaming not to touch it, but my body moved on its own. I crouched, hand shaking, and picked it up. There was only one sentence written on it. You should have answered. I dropped the paper as if it had burned me, my breath stuttering in my throat. And then, the door creaked open. I stumbled back, my blood turning to ice. No, it was locked. The hinges whined, the gap widening inch by inch. The hallway beyond was dark, too dark, like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I stepped back further, my entire body screaming, run. Then something stepped inside. Not a patient, not a person, something else. Its limbs were too long, its neck craned unnaturally to the side, as if it had been broken and never set right. The air around it warped, like heat rising off asphalt, but freezing cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It stood in the doorway, head tilting, watching me without eyes. Then it smiled, a mouth stretching too wide, too deep, filled with something that wasn't teeth. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed directly at me. My heart slammed against my ribs, terror clamping around my lungs. It didn't move closer. It didn't speak. It just waited. And somehow, that was worse. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stand there, drowning in my own terror. Then, a sound from behind me, a whisper, barely audible, slipping through the cracks in reality. He's still here. My stomach dropped. I turned my head just a fraction, just enough to see the shadow behind me. The head doctor had never left. He was still here. And now, they both were. The thing in the doorway and the shadow behind me. I could feel them closing in. The head doctor's presence pressed against my back like a cold weight, the air around me stagnant, suffocating, wrong. And in front of me, the thing with the stretched smile stood motionless, its two long fingers curling slightly, like it was deciding what to do next. I was trapped. If I moved, one of them would notice. If I breathed too loudly, one of them would take me. My mind raced, trying to find an escape, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be made. And then, the thing in the doorway moved. Not like a person, like a puppet. A sickening, disjointed lurch forward, its head twisting too far to the side, its smile never fading. The moment it took a step into the room, the lights flickered violently, shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. It was breaking something, something that wasn't supposed to be broken. Behind me, the air shifted. The head doctor was moving too. I was out of time. The thing in the doorway took another step, and I swore I heard something inside it crack. A bone? A joint? Something worse? Then, the lights went out. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. For a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. Not just the absence of noise, but something else, like sound itself had been swallowed whole. Then, just as quickly, the power surged back. They were both gone. The doorway was empty. The air behind me was still. I spun around, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. The office looked exactly the same, but it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. Something had changed. Something I couldn't see. And then I heard it. The intercom. A sharp burst of static crackling through the room. Then, a voice. But not just any voice. Mine. Please, it whispered through the speakers. Let me in. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. The same words that had come from behind my door. Then, more static. And another voice, deeper, colder. The head doctor. You should have answered. I slammed my hands over my ears, my heart pounding. The intercom cut off. The silence that followed felt alive, like something was still listening. I had to get out of here. I bolted for the door, throwing it open, stepping into the dimly lit hallway. 3:12 a.m. I just had to last another hour. But then, a sound, soft, subtle, scratching, inside the walls. I froze. Rule 2. I knew what the rule said. If you hear scratching inside the walls, do not investigate. But my brain betrayed me, turning against me, whispering questions I didn't want answers to. What if it's just the pipes? What if it's just rats? What if... No, it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. The scratching wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was behind me. Slow, deliberate drags of nails against the surface of the hallway. My chest tightened. I kept my eyes forward. I wouldn't turn around. I wouldn't... A voice, from behind me, soft, playful. Look at me. I clenched my teeth, my breathing sharp and uneven. No, I wouldn't. Something cold brushed against my shoulder. I ran. Down the hallway, past the locked patient rooms, past the flickering lights, past the shadows that twisted just out of sight. 3:25 a.m. I could make it. A door slammed shut behind me. Not just one, all of them. Every single patient room door in the hallway slammed shut at the same time. I skidded to a stop, my pulse hammering. Then, the intercom crackled again. The voice that came through wasn't mine this time. It wasn't even human. A garbled, wet sound layered over itself, twisting in and out of static. Then, one word: run. The lights overhead burst. Glass rained down around me, and the hallway was plunged into darkness. And then, the morgue door creaked open. My stomach dropped. No. No, no, no. The rule. The morgue must be locked at exactly 3:33 a.m. If it isn't, the bodies inside will get up. They don't always stay in their own skin. I had 1 minute. I sprinted down the hallway, shoving past the broken glass, my own footsteps pounding against the floor. The morgue door was yawning open, the cold inside curling out like fingers. I reached it, and I saw them, bodies, not lying down, standing. Limbs twisted, faces blank, heads tilted too far, and the worst part, they were all looking at me. I lunged for the door, my fingers fumbling for the keys, my breath ragged, panicked. 30 seconds. One of the bodies stepped forward. Not a normal step, a snap of movement, like it had been dragged forward by something unseen. 20 seconds. Another moved. Its skin sagged as if it didn't fit right. 15 seconds. The third one grinned. Its lips split open, stretching wide, revealing nothing inside. 10 seconds. The first body lunged. I slammed the door shut. The lock clicked into place just as the clock hit 3:33 a.m. Silence. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, my body trembling. It was over. But then, from the other side of the door, a knock. Slow, soft, wrong. And then a voice. You were almost too late. Not a patient's voice. Not the head doctor's. Not mine. Something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. The air around me turned ice cold. I wasn't alone. I would never be alone again. The air felt thick, suffocating, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The knock on the morgue door echoed inside my skull, over and over, each tap of bone against metal vibrating down my spine. Then another knock, louder, and then a voice. Let me out. The same voice that had spoken before. But now, it wasn't just coming from the other side of the morgue door. It was coming from behind me. I spun around so fast, my vision blurred, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was empty, but the air wasn't. It was watching me. I could feel it, a presence pressing against the back of my skull, whispering just beneath my hearing. You were almost too late. The words still lingered in my head, crawling under my skin. I had locked the morgue in time. I had followed the rule. So why didn't it feel like I was safe? I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here before. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not from behind the morgue door, not from the hallway, from above. My breath hitched. There was no second floor. And yet the footsteps moved across the ceiling, heavy and uneven, like something was crawling along the surface, dragging itself forward. The sound stopped directly above me, a single sharp tap against the ceiling tiles. Then another, and then a crack. A thin, splintering line snaked across the ceiling, black as ink, stretching outward as if something was pushing through from the other side. I took a step back. Then another. The crack widened. A sliver of darkness peeked through. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched before me. Too long, the walls too narrow, too close. Something moved in the corner of my eye. A shadow. No, a shape. A patient, standing just outside their room, head tilted, watching me. Their door had been locked. They weren't supposed to be outside. Rule 4. If a patient knocks on your door after midnight, do not answer. But I hadn't answered. And yet, the patient took a step forward. My pulse pounded against my ribs. I kept moving, faster, ignoring the way the shadows shifted, the way more figures started appearing in doorways, silent, staring. They weren't supposed to be outside. Then why were they? The answer came with the next sound. A slow, echoing creak behind me. The morgue door. It was open. I didn't look. I couldn't, because I already knew what that meant. I ran down the endless hallway, past the watching patients, past the flickering lights, past something whispering my name from the vents above. I saw the stairwell up ahead and lunged for the door, slamming into it, shoving it open. A hand grabbed my wrist, cold, thin, too many fingers. I screamed, twisting, yanking away, but it held on, nails digging into my skin, tearing through flesh. Then, a voice, low, hushed. You looked too long. I yanked free. The thing that had grabbed me staggered backward, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't wait. I hurled myself into the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. I needed to get to the security office. I needed to check the monitors. Because something was wrong. Something had been wrong since the moment I stepped into this place. The hallways had shifted. The rules had changed. And I didn't understand why. The security room door was locked, but I had a key. My hands shook so violently, I could barely shove it into the lock. Finally, the door swung open. The monitors flickered, and the first thing I saw made my stomach drop. The morgue. The door was still closed, locked, exactly how I had left it. But I had heard it open. I had felt them behind me. I had seen them standing in the hallway. Hadn't I? A new kind of fear settled in. Something worse than being chased. Worse than being hunted. What if I wasn't being hunted at all? What if I was being played with? A new sound crackled over the intercom. Soft, whispered. Almost time. A sharp knock on the security room door. I went still. Another knock. Then, the doorknob started turning. I scrambled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The intercom crackled again. A voice. Not the same distorted voice as before. This one was familiar. My voice. Open the door. I shook my head violently. No, I wasn't falling for it. Another knock. Then, something slid under the door. A photo. I hesitated. Then slowly I reached for it. My fingers trembled as I lifted the picture into the dim light. It was a security still from one of the monitors, from inside the security room. And in the photo, I wasn't alone. There was something behind me, standing in the corner, tall, shadow thin, its face missing. I felt the air shift, a slow breath against my neck. I turned and the lights cut out. The only thing I heard before everything went black was the door unlocking. And then, a voice. You broke the rules. The air around me shifted. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening, watching. Then something moved. Not footsteps, not breathing, something gliding. I knew what that meant. My chest seized, my lungs locked up. Rule 5. When the head doctor does his nightly rounds, stand perfectly still. I had no choice. I froze. The blackness around me felt alive, pressing in like it wanted to swallow me whole. The door behind me let out a soft creak, the sound of wood bending under pressure. Then, a shape, not walking, drifting. My mind screamed me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure glided closer. My vision adjusted just enough to make out a towering silhouette, too tall, too thin, its limbs hanging loosely, like something wearing a human shape wrong. The head doctor. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste blood. I didn't blink, didn't breathe. If he noticed me, he would take me with him. The figure stopped, right in front of me. I could feel it now, cold, seeping into my skin, like the space around it wasn't just air, but something else, something wrong. Its head tilted, listening. I wasn't breathing, not yet. Then a sound from inside the room, a whisper, soft, too soft to be human. You shouldn't be here. It wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the corner. I couldn't look. I couldn't move. The figure shifted, noticed. The whispering stopped. A long silence stretched. Then, the head doctor moved past me. He didn't walk. He slid through the door, into the hallway. The second he was gone, I gasped in a breath. Too loud, too sharp. A mistake, because the whisper in the room, it wasn't gone, it was closer. He's not the worst thing here. Something brushed against my leg. I bolted. The second my foot hit the hallway, the overhead lights flickered back on. For a split second, I saw something in the security room, crouched in the corner, grinning. Then the door slammed shut behind me. I ran. My body was screaming, my mind racing, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not when I heard shuffling footsteps down the corridor. Not when I saw the patients standing in their doorways again. Not when one of them, the same one as before, tilted their head and smiled. Something was happening. The rules weren't just breaking, they were changing. And I didn't know why. I reached the front desk, slamming my hand against the intercom. Static burst from the speaker. Then a voice. My voice. You're not supposed to be here. I ripped my hand away. My breath hitched, because something was standing right behind the desk. At first, I thought it was a person, a patient, until I saw its hands. Too long, too thin, bent at the wrong angles. It was wearing a hospital gown, but it wasn't a patient. It took a slow step forward, head tilting, and then it knocked on the counter. Once, twice, 3 times. Rule 4. If a patient knocks on your door after midnight, do not answer. It wasn't a patient. It took another step forward. The intercom crackled again. A whisper. Run. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted down the hall, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The thing behind the desk didn't chase me, but I could feel it watching. I needed to end this. I needed to get out. I reached the nearest emergency exit, locked. I tried another, locked. Every door, every hallway. This place wasn't letting me leave. A new noise broke the silence, scratching, inside the walls. Rule 2. If you hear scratching inside the walls, do not investigate. I squeezed my eyes shut, ignored it. Then, a hole split open in the plaster. Not a crack, not a gap. A hole, like something had peeled it open from the inside. And then I saw it. Fingers, too many, stretching outward, reaching. A voice slithered out. You see me. The fingers twitched. I backed away. I had broken the rule. I had seen it, and now it knew I existed. The intercom crackled one last time, and this time, it wasn't a whisper. It wasn't my voice. It was something else, something older. Come to the morgue. My stomach turned to ice. No, I wasn't going there. But my feet moved anyway. The hallways were changing, twisting. Doors I had passed before were gone. The lights dimmed, and somehow I was back in front of the morgue. The door was open. The room was dark. Inside, something shifted. Waiting. The voice whispered again. Come see. And before I could stop myself, before I could even think, I stepped inside. And in the darkness, something breathed. Close. Too close. The door behind me had slammed shut, and when I reached back for the handle, my fingers met cold metal. It wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The breathing continued. Slow. Measured. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to stay still, even though my body screamed to run. The room was dark, but not pitch black. Faint red emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across the steel drawers that lined the walls. And then, one of the drawers slid open. The metallic scrape cut through the silence. I stopped breathing. The drawer pulled out completely, revealing a body covered by a sheet. The air grew colder. The whisper returned, curling around me like a coiled snake. You shouldn't be here. The sheet on the body shifted. And then, it sat up. I stumbled back, slamming into the locked door. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, so loud I swore the thing could hear it. The sheet slowly peeled away. Underneath wasn't a person. Not anymore. Its skin was wrong, too smooth, too stretched, like it had been pulled tight over the bones of something else. Its mouth curved into a grotesque, unnatural smile, lips splitting at the corners as it whispered, You left the door unlocked. No, I had locked it. I had made sure. Hadn't I? The thing tilted its head. Its neck cracked. Then, the other drawers started opening. One by one, metal groaned as the morgue came to life. Bodies rose. Not all of them moved right. Some sat up slowly, deliberate, inhuman. Others twitched violently, their limbs bending at angles that should have been impossible. The air filled with the sound of bones popping, flesh stretching. They were getting out. My pulse thundered. I had to run. I turned to the door and grabbed the handle with both hands. It was ice cold. My fingers fumbled, slipping against the metal. Behind me, something stepped onto the floor, bare feet against tile. Soft, wet. The whisper slithered across my skin. They don't always stay in their own skin. I yanked the handle. Pulled. Nothing. A body lurched toward me. I could hear the skin stretching. The others followed, limbs dragging, eyes watching. No time. I threw my entire weight against the door. It burst open. I staggered back into the hallway, gasping as the air shifted. The fluorescent lights flickered. The morgue door started closing. Not slamming. Slowly. Like something was pushing it shut from the inside. Through the narrowing gap, I saw them. The bodies. Standing. Smiling. And just before the door sealed completely, one of them stepped forward, wearing my face. I ran. The hallway wasn't the same anymore. It stretched on endlessly, the lights humming above me. Doors lined the walls, all of them shut. No windows, no exits. The air smelled like formaldehyde. I kept moving. Footsteps echoed behind me. Not running, walking, deliberate. Something was following me. I passed a door. The nameplate read Dr. Harland Everett. I didn't recognize it. I passed another, Dr. Harland Everett. Then another, and another. The same name, over and over and over. The footsteps were getting closer. I turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway was a figure. Tall, thin, not walking, gliding. No, this wasn't possible. The head doctor had already passed me. He had moved on, hadn't he? His head tilted, his arms hung at his sides too long. Then, the lights cut out. Total blackness. The air turned freezing, and then right beside my ear, I can still hear you breathing. My chest seized. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to go still. If he noticed me, he would take me with him. The silence stretched. Then, something brushed against my arm, not fingers, not skin, something cold, like fabric. I bit down on my tongue, fighting the urge to scream. The darkness shifted, a presence loomed over me, waiting. I didn't breathe, didn't move. Seconds passed, then minutes, then the temperature rose. The lights flickered back on. The hallway was empty. The doors were different now. I turned to the closest one. The nameplate read mine. I stared. Slowly, I reached for the handle. It turned easily. The door swung open. Inside was a hospital room, but it wasn't empty. Someone was lying in the bed, hooked up to machines, still, too still. I stepped closer, and then the figure in the bed turned its head and looked at me. My blood turned to ice because I was looking at myself, pale, motionless, eyes open. I was in the bed. I staggered back. The monitors beeped. The air turned thick. The thing in the bed smiled, and then in my own voice it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The lights burst and everything went black. The darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment, I wasn't anywhere. No walls, no floor, no air, just an endless void pressing against me, wrapping around me like something alive. Then, a sound, not a whisper, not a breath, something wet, dripping. The darkness cracked. A single flickering bulb buzzed to life above me, casting weak, stuttering light onto white tile. My hands were pressed against the cold floor, my knees aching beneath me. My head pounded like a drum, and when I lifted it, I realized I was in a hallway. But it wasn't the hospital hallway I knew. The tiles were yellowed, stained with something dark. The walls bulged in places, like something was pressing against them from the inside. The air was thick with the stench of antiseptic, and something far worse, rotting flesh. A door stood at the far end of the corridor, slightly open, and from inside, the dripping continued, slow, rhythmic. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady beneath me. My fingers trembled as I reached for the nearest wall to steady myself. Something moved beneath the surface. I jerked my hand away. No, I wasn't going to look. Not at the walls, not at whatever was behind them. The rules. The rules were there for a reason. The whisper from before curled around my thoughts. If you see it, it will know you exist. I turned toward the door. The closer I got, the colder the air became. The dripping grew louder. I reached the threshold. The room beyond was wrong. A single surgical table stood in the center, under a swaying overhead light. Strapped to the table was a body, its chest rising and falling unnaturally, as if something inside it was pushing against the skin. The source of the dripping. A mass of tubes snaked from the body's mouth, leading into a large, rusted metal basin at the foot of the table. A thick, black liquid oozed through them, drop by drop, filling the container with something wrong. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. The thing in the bed turned its head, its eyes snapped open, and I made the mistake of looking. For 1 second, 2, 3, a smile split its face, not slow, instant, from ear to ear. Its jaw cracked, the tubes in its throat twitched, and then it lunged. I stumbled back, barely avoiding its grasping claw-like fingers as the restraints on the bed snapped like brittle string. I turned to run, but the doorway was gone. Nothing but a blank wall. The air shifted. Something was behind me. I turned, and it was right there. Not on the bed anymore. Standing, mouth stretched impossibly wide, jaw hanging open in a silent, endless scream. Its arms extended, growing longer, bones snapping. It reached for me. I had nowhere to go. The walls. The walls. I spun toward them, pressed my palms against the pulsing, twitching surface, and I pushed. The world collapsed. I was falling, through something thick, suffocating, wet. Hands clawed at me from the dark, grasping at my skin, my clothes, and then I hit the floor, hard. The air rushed back into my lungs. I gasped, my entire body shaking. Where was I? I pushed myself up, my hands pressing against cold tile. No, not again. I knew this place, the hospital hallway, the real one. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sterile white light over the gleaming floor. The walls were clean. The air smelled of antiseptic. I turned and froze. At the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, the head doctor, still, watching, waiting. No, I had already seen him. Hadn't I? Hadn't he passed? He moved, not walking, gliding. His mouth stretched into an impossibly wide, unnatural grin. His voice slithered through the air. You're not supposed to be here. The lights flickered. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor, my breath tearing through my lungs. The hallway stretched ahead, endless, doors blurring past me. A sound. Footsteps. Not mine. Behind me, I didn't dare look back. A door ahead, slightly open. I threw myself inside. Darkness. I turned, shoving the door shut, pressing my weight against it. Silence. No footsteps. No whispering. But I wasn't alone. The room wasn't empty. A chair sat in the center, and in it, someone sat with their back to me, motionless, unmoving. A nameplate on the desk beside them. Dr. Harland Everett. The name that had been on all the doors. My pulse pounded. Slowly, the figure tilted its head. A whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't have come here." It stood and turned. The face, it was mine, smiling, and then it lunged. The lights shattered. Everything went black. And then, a breath. Not mine, slow, shuddering, right beside my ear, a hand pressed against my throat. Not grabbing, feeling, measuring my pulse. I tried to move, but my body was frozen. Not paralyzed, but held. The air around me thickened, pressing against my skin like something living. My heartbeat slammed inside my chest, a frantic, uneven rhythm. Then, a voice. Low. "You don't belong here." The grip on my throat tightened, my lungs screamed for air, and then I fell. Not onto a floor. Not through space. I fell through something else. Thick, wet, like sinking into a body that wasn't mine. Then impact. I hit something hard. I gasped, coughing, clawing at the ground beneath me. My fingers dug into cold tile. The air smelled like antiseptic, like the hospital. I forced my head up, my breath rattling through my lungs. I was lying in the middle of the hallway, the real one. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything was still, but something was wrong. The hallway, it wasn't empty. A figure stood at the far end, staring at me. No, not staring, waiting. I couldn't see its face, just a dark silhouette, tall and unmoving, its head tilted slightly, as if listening. A whisper slithered through the air, but it didn't come from the figure. It came from behind me. I didn't turn. I wouldn't. I pushed myself up, my legs shaking beneath me. The figure didn't move. But I knew, if I stayed here, it would. I took a slow step back, then another. A low creak echoed through the hallway. A door, one of the patient rooms, opening. Not fast, not sudden, slow, like someone was letting me know they were coming out. I turned, and something was there. Not a person, not a patient. It was wrong. Tall, its limbs too long, its mouth hanging open. Not a scream, not a breath, just open. Black liquid dripped from its lips. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. Footsteps pounded behind me, too fast, too light, too many. I wasn't being chased by one thing. There were more. I reached the nearest door, the morgue. No, I couldn't go in there. Not at this time, not at 3:33 a.m. A sound. From the other side of the door, a single slow knock. From inside. My breath stopped. No, I turned, and they were there. Standing, watching, mouths open, and then they moved. Not running, not walking, gliding, like the head doctor. Like something that shouldn't be moving at all. I stumbled back, and the door behind me swung open. The air inside was freezing. A voice drifted from the dark. "You forgot to lock the door." And the bodies inside, they got up. The first one sat up slowly, its head tilting too far, bones cracking. Another peeled itself from the metal table, its skin loose, slipping. They weren't human anymore. They weren't in their own skin. I ran, down the hallway. The lights flickered, casting long, twisting shadows that moved when nothing else did. Something grabbed my wrist, cold, too many fingers. I screamed, twisting away. And then, the hallway ended. Not a door, not a wall, nothing, just blackness. I stopped too late. The floor vanished beneath me. I was falling, through nothing, through something that knew me. And then a whisper. "You broke the rules." A hand caught me. Not one, many, too many, and they pulled me under. I couldn't fight them. The hands wrapped around my arms, my legs, my throat, cold, too many fingers, too strong. They weren't just pulling me down, they were dragging me somewhere. I thrashed, but it was like trying to move in a dream, slow, useless. The darkness around me wasn't empty. It was alive, moving, breathing, watching. Whispers slithered past my ears, familiar voices. The head doctor, the patients, the things that had been knocking at my door. They were all here, waiting. Then a sound. Not whispering, not breathing, scratching. Inside the walls. No, not the walls. The darkness itself. I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I wasn't anywhere. Something was moving toward me. Not walking, not running, gliding. I tried to scream. A hand covered my mouth. A voice hissed into my ear. "You were warned." The hand forced my head to the side. Something opened in the dark. A door? No. A mouth. Too wide, too deep, too full of teeth. The whispers turned into screaming. Not mine. Theirs. The things in the dark. They didn't want me to go. I wasn't supposed to leave. I felt the pull tighten, hard, desperate. I was being torn in two directions, one dragging me deeper, one pushing me forward. I made a choice. I lunged toward the open mouth. The hands ripped away from me. The darkness screamed. And then I was falling again. Through the dark. Through something else. Through a place that shouldn't exist. And then I hit the ground. Hard. Cold tile. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I was back in the hallway, the real one, the hospital. I gasped, my chest heaving, my hands shaking. Had I imagined it? Had it even been real? A noise. Footsteps. I turned and froze. The head doctor stood at the end of the hallway, not moving, not breathing, just watching me. No, not watching, waiting. I went still, perfectly still, no breathing, no blinking. He glided forward, closer, closer. My lungs burned, my chest aching to take a breath, but I couldn't. If he noticed, if he knew I was still alive, he would take me. He stopped inches away. I felt the air shift, something cold and wrong brushing against my skin. Then he moved past me, like I wasn't even there. I stood there, frozen, until the air felt normal again, until he was gone. Then I ran. I didn't care where, just away. I turned a corner and stopped. A figure stood in the middle of the hallway. A patient. No, not just any patient. The first one I ever broke the rules with, the one I had looked at for too long. Their head tilted. A smile stretched across their face, too wide, too knowing. They had been waiting. For me. They took a step forward. I stepped back. They followed. I turned to run and stopped dead. The hallway behind me was gone. Nothing but blackness. Something whispered inside it, something waiting to pull me back in. I turned back to the patient. They smiled wider and then they spoke. A whisper. You don't get to leave. I ran anyway, right into them. The world went black, and the last thing I felt was hands closing around my throat,